In this session, we'll be continuing our examination of the general topic of what is Christian cultural heritage as we seek to investigate, what it is we're going to be looking at in this course, laying the framework for some of the other things that we'll be incorporating. And thinking about largely, the ideas of the importance of Christianity in Western civilization, both as a transformative spiritual force, but also in other types of ways as well. And so we're kind of investigating those aspects. We finished up in our last session with the question, what makes something Christian? A very important question to consider in a variety of ways. First, of course, from an academic standpoint in thinking about this course, and so we're talking about Christian cultural heritage. So what aspects are we going to be looking at? What aspects make something Christian for us to pay attention to? But of course, there's also the spiritual component of thinking about those things that are appropriate for Christians, what makes someone a Christian, how does one become a Christian, all of those things from a spiritual standpoint. And so this is a very important question, especially from the standpoint of thinking about Christian cultural heritage. And ultimately, I think that we, and again, obviously I'm, kind of transmitting information here, and so, maybe some discussion of this has been done in the discussion boards, but I think probably most of us would agree that at a base level, right, absolute broad way of talking about Christianity, right? Although there would be a lot of differences, in the particulars, these are probably some components that we would all agree on as a base minimum of what Christianity is. Although, as we noted in the last session, there have been some important historical differences about these questions. But in general, I think we would all agree that Christian has to do with the idea of Jesus, particularly things related to the nature of Jesus. Right? Jesus is the Son of God, but also, of course, some other claims about Jesus. Jesus as the sacrifice for sins, Jesus rising from the dead. And again, if you haven't had the chance to take a look at and watch or listen to the N.T. Wright video, I encourage you to do that. You can do that in any order, even though it's further down in the playlist. So Jesus Christ, His death, His resurrection. Paul refers to that as the gospel, right? He died, He was buried, rose again. We can include other things related to, Jesus as our high priest, that He intercedes for us with God, all sorts of things that we could say about Jesus. But at the base, right, Christianity is focused on the person of Jesus. While Jesus would certainly be important in other systems, other religious traditions, Islam places very high respect upon Jesus, but Jesus is simply one of a number of prophets in Islam, although a very important one, where Christianity says, well, no, it's not just one of, right? The center of it all, the center of existence, of meaning, of purpose, is Jesus Christ. And so the importance of Jesus, all that entails, an important component of this. Second, we talked about the idea that there are certain beliefs that one needs to accept intellectually, have an orthodoxy. Excuse me. Thirdly, we would say that there would be certain actions or rituals that one must partake of as part of being a Christian. And fourthly, the idea of it's not just rote religion, it's not just intellectual assent to propositions, it's not just engaging in certain activities. Christianity has to do with a certain way of life. And so the Christian part, the Christian component of Christian cultural heritage, again, although we're not totally in agreement on everything, that what we see here is there are certain claims, truth claims, about Jesus, about humanity, about the response to God. They're all wrapped up in Christian. So I think that, again, while we could get really specific and break down and really divide among groups, I think that's a broad enough understanding to get us in a place to say, okay, we're all on the same page when we're talking about the Christian component of this. So now we turn to that second question, or the second word, culture, and cultural. And in thinking about culture, and what is Christian cultural heritage? Culture is often one of those elements of human experience that we kind of have an idea about, or we can provide examples of, even if we might not be able to fully put it into words. So I want to share with you some definitions of a variety of scholars, 3 definitions from different scholars regarding how they have attempted to define culture as opposed to trying to give examples of culture. So some scholars would say that culture is the integrated system of learned patterns of ideas, values, behaviors, and products characteristic of a society. So essentially here what we're talking about is that societies have ideas, values, behaviors, and products that excuse me, that make it different from another society. That those ideas, values, behaviors, and products are all kind of interconnected with each other, and these things are learned by people that are part of that culture. Other scholars have said, well, the culture is the shared patterns of behaviors and interactions, cognitive constructs, and effective understanding that are learned through a process of socialization, identifying the members of a culture group while also distinguishing those of another group. In some ways, this definition is saying much the same thing in slightly different ways. First of all, of course, there's that idea of shared, right? And it's shared things that are a part of a particular culture group that are different from another culture group. But essentially, we have the same kind of ideas, right? Behaviors, cognitive constructs is another way to say ideas, perhaps. This definition, of course, includes the idea of effective understanding, and the A there, of course, suggests the idea of emotions that are a part of this, and that these things, of course, again, are learned. A third definition of culture would be the learned and shared human patterns or models for living, day-to-day living patterns. These patterns and models pervade all aspects of human social interaction. Now, there are a couple things from this definition that are slightly different. Right? The emphasis here being on day-to-day living patterns. Right? It's not just these grand ideas, but it affects the day-to-day. There isn't as much of a distinction here in this definition between one cultural group and another, although that would probably, certainly the person that wrote this would suggest that. But here too, the idea of sharing, right? It's not just an individual aspect, but that this is shared among a group. These things are learned. They are patterns or models. And particularly in this definition, the emphasis is that culture pervades everything. That as we interact with other people in our society, or as we interact with the products of our society, we are shaped by culture. Well, there are other definitions of culture that we could use, but there are a couple things I think that this is the more important component here, and it's not necessarily learning these definitions, but seeing some things here about culture. So one of the things that's emphasized in all of these definitions is the idea that culture is something that is learned. Culture is not something that is innate. That the incorporation of culture into a person's life, whether that is someone who is born into a particular culture, or someone who decides to move and live in a different culture, like a missionary, for example, or an anthropologist, culture must be learned. Now, in some respects, this is the cognitive component of culture. Right? It affects how we think. So, culture is something we learn over time. It's not something that we're immediately born with. One of the definitions, the second definition, talked about socialization. Groups have this way in which people are socialized into the group, where they learn the norms, the values, the things that are appropriate, the things that are not appropriate. And all groups have this kind of mechanism. Sometimes it is, something that is, like if you're converting to a religion, right? You might read a series of texts that tell you about that culture, that prepare you for the aspects of culture that you're planning on taking on. Other times, of course, culture is learned in a less formal type of way, and not necessarily through texts. Instead, we learn culture through, growing up. Our parents teach us things, schools teach us things, religious groups teach us things, media teaches us things regarding culture and cultural norms. So we have to recognize, in many respects, that this aspect of our existence is something that is learned, even though that learning might be kind of more informal. What do we learn? Well, we learn ideas. We learn habits of thinking, also a cognitive component. We learn things about the truths of our culture. What are the things that, what are the ideas that are important? What are the beliefs of that culture? Slightly distinct from a third component, of course, is the values of the culture. Right? What are those things that are virtuous? What are those things that are forbidden? What are those things that are valued? What are those things that are discounted? More of an evaluative component rather than specifically cognitive. Certainly, though, values can be cognitive in the sense of, okay, I can intellectually list the values. But there is also that internalization of values, where I don't maybe spend as much time thinking about what are important concepts, what are important virtues in a culture. There's that developed habit of thinking about what's good, what's wrong, that I've incorporated into my life. And so I make value judgments as I live in a culture. Again, sometimes not necessarily cognizant of it, but more kind of internalized values about what's important. There is also, culture has to do with behaviors, which is both an evaluative component of life and an affective component, an emotional component. that there are certain things that are acceptable, there are certain things that are unacceptable, there are certain behaviors that are acceptable at certain times and not others, okay? And there are essentially rules governing that behavior. The ideas, the values of culture often govern behavior. So that we think of, we don't necessarily think of, but we become accustomed to certain standards of conduct in certain situations, and that those standards change from different situations. How you behave at a football game is different than how you behave at a wedding or a funeral. Although in certain situations, some of those behaviors that would be traditionally unacceptable at a funeral might be acceptable if it is a certain type of situation, the closeness of a family member, just the life that that particular person lived. So behavior, cultural behavior, is a very complex aspect of human life. And within that behavior, the ideas and the values police that behavior. And often what happens is that those ideas and values have been internalized by others, so that when they see certain behaviors that transgress those norms, that transgress those ideas, they engage in other behaviors to attempt to correct this person that has transgressed those boundaries. For example, things like shame, guilt, expressions of disapproval, or expressions of support if somebody is participating appropriately in the behaviors of the culture. All of these are ways in which culture is policed so that behavior is brought in line with what it should be, and it also becomes a way to exhibit or to encourage the learning of a culture, right? So that as as someone is learning how to live in culture, they might engage in behaviors that a particular group finds inappropriate, or maybe even to the point of being offensive. And so certain behaviors are policed by shaming that person, by singling out that person, by enacting some sort of social punishment on that person in order to kind of bring them back in line with what they should be, how they should be behaving in culture. And sometimes it's even to the point where people don't realize what they're doing.